Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Philippa Strum. I direct the Division of United States Studies, which, with the leadership of the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center, has organized this program this morning. I know that some of you are new to the Wilson Center, and I want just to take a moment to tell you something about the center in which you now sit. The Wilson Center was organized by Congress in 1968 as the living memorial to the only president of the United States who earned a PhD, and that is true to this day. Some of you may know that before he entered the world of politics, Wilson was a major scholar, a political scientist who produced many volumes, and who was the president of Princeton University. What the Wilson Center seeks to do is bring together the two parts of Wilson's life, the policymaking part and the scholarly part. And so we try to have programming that will enable scholars and policymakers to talk about subjects that are of great interest to both and to the nation as well. And surely no subject could be more important on the policy agenda of the United States today than immigrant integration in the United States and in the District of Columbia as a microcosm of what is happening throughout this country. So we have a long program organized for you with really wonderful speakers who I thank very much for giving us their time this morning. And so welcome again, and I'd like now to introduce my colleague, Andrew Selle, who directs the Mexico Institute of the Wilson Center.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of the Latin American program, we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this with the Division of U.S. Studies. The purpose of the meeting today is to really sort of shift a little bit the debate on immigration away from immigrants as objects of policy to immigrants as leaders in changes that are taking place in this country. This is part of a larger project with Xochitl Bada we'll talk about in a minute, but really look not just what we've looked at in Washington a lot for the last few months has been immigration policy and the tendencies to talk about immigrants as sort of an issue in policy. Well, one of the things that's going on in this country is that immigrants are transforming this country in important new ways. There are incredible experiences going on around this, and there are also incredible obstacles going on around this. We've been fortunate with support from the MacArthur Foundation to be in the middle of a 7-city study, trying to look primarily at cities that have not been studied very much in terms of immigrant civic and political participation, Latin American immigrant civic political participation. Xochitl will talk more in detail about this. But we felt it was particularly important to look at D.C. for a couple reasons. One is it's our home. And for those of you that are from D.C., you know that organizations like the Wilson Center quite often tend to overlook our home. We tend to do things that are national and international issues, and we don't pay enough attention to the community that we live in. So we thought it was particularly important as we were looking at issues around the country to make sure that Washington was one of the case studies. Secondly, Washington is a really exciting story in many ways. For those that lived here 20 or 30 years ago, you know that there were several organizations like Casa de Maryland, Carecen, Ayuda, many others, Latin American Youth Center, and so on and so forth, you could name them, that were extremely involved in the community, but primarily trying to deal with a population that was fleeing from war, that was coming to the United States, sometimes for economic reasons, and dealing primarily with social service issues. Today, we have a vastly different situation 20 years later. We're talking about an immigrant community that is incredibly diverse, incredibly energized, that has elected leaders, that has moved even these organizations into questions of empowerment, that has since last year, since the marches, the emergence of new leadership, that's facing new challenges also in terms of things that are going on in Prince William County and elsewhere around in the suburbs that are presenting new challenges but also new options for strategy. So it's a very interesting city. It's a very diverse city. D.C. is one of the most diverse immigrant communities around the country. No group particularly dominates immigrant streams in this city. It's diverse among Latin American immigrants, but it's also diverse with African and European and Asian immigrants as well. And this is an interesting city because it's also the seat of many of the leading immigrant advocacy organizations around the country. It's the seat of government, and it's also the seat of local issues. And had a chance to talk with someone from the Washington Post the other day. Said, is the Washington Post a national paper? And he said, well, the Washington Post is actually a local paper that has to deal with national issues. And to some extent, that's true of organizations, whether immigrant-led organizations or others that organize around local community issues in D.C. I mean, you always have to deal with those two realities. Organizing around very local issues. We're a local community like any other. I grew up here. This is a city that is very much a local community that has roots, but it also is a city that is the seat of government, and that creates a very interesting dynamic in these kind of organizations. I want to recognize a couple of people. One is Kate Brick, who's back there, who's been the primary organizer of this meeting, and anyone who has further questions might want to chat with her. Lenny Gonzalez, who's been, you'll hear from shortly because she'll be moderating the first panel, has been a leading voice in putting this together and has been kind of a key advisor on this. We appreciate that. Diana Rodriguez on the staff here, and Gabi Baca, who are out there actually, key people in putting this together. And Consul General of Mexico, Enrique Escorza, very glad to have you here as well. So. And thanks to all the panelists for coming. We're expecting a pretty good crowd this morning. A few people are going to be filtering in. Let me turn over to Xochitl Bada, who is the co-PI, principal investigator on the larger project that we have here at the Wilson Center on immigrant civic and political participation.
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for putting this wonderful program together of immigrant participation in 6 medium-sized cities, which I'm going to tell you more about in a second. And this is the continuation of a project the Woodrow Wilson Center supported 2 years ago with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation that was put together by Jonathan Fox, Gaspar Rivera Salgado, myself, and Andrew Seeley, trying to understand the practices of civic nationality of Mexican migrants in the United States. We tried to understand how migrants were integrated into U.S. social fabric, and we invited a group of leaders and scholars and advocacy members of the advocacy community here to Washington to discuss those issues. And as a result, we produced a book that was edited by the Woodrow Wilson Center at the University of California in Santa Cruz called Invisible No More. And I hope that maybe Andrew can show you some samples if there are some still. Okay, one out there on the table. It was a bilingual publication. And one of the things that we discovered is that this movement of the 2006 marches of immigrants in the spring was the result of a long process of silent organizing, of these people that were in the grassroots community, very active in the local communities, working very hard for having their voices heard. And that at times were successful, at times they weren't. But after the marches, we realized that it was very important to map out what were they doing and in what places, to understand the context of reception and the main differences of practices of integration for Latin American migrants. So thanks to the MacArthur Foundation, we are now in this new project when we are trying to compare the best practices and the challenges that not only Mexican migrants, but now Latin American immigrants are facing in places where they have not received enough scholarly attention. So we selected 5 medium-sized cities and 2 global cities to understand how the context of reception matters, to understand these practices. And we chose the cities of Dallas, Texas, Omaha, Nebraska, Charlotte, North Carolina, Las Vegas, Nevada, Fresno, California, and we are comparing them with DC and Chicago. And what we've been doing is conducting, during this fall, is conducting a series of roundtable discussions with migrant leaders that are active in the following arenas: labor organizing, but not only unions, but also worker center and independent labor centers, faith-based organizations of all denominations, both evangelical, Catholic, Pentecostal, etc., Spanish language media, the weeklies, the dailies, also the radio stations, TV stations, and the so-called hometown associations or the ethnic organizations that have more of an idea of organizing through civic by nationality. And then what we try to do is, after we publish the results next summer of 2008, we are planning to bring all the leaders of these six cities to Washington, D.C. for launching the report and try to compare the results. We are partnering with institutions that have a long-standing good track record of working with immigrants, such as research centers, universities, and advocacy organizations. And we want to make sure that now immigrants are understood as political actors and also as civic agents, and understand also how they are transforming the social fabric in the communities where they live. So hopefully today, this roundtable discussion of DC will give us lots of opportunities of discussion, and I hope that it will be very productive what we discovered today. Thank you.
Buenos días. Good morning. I'm Lenny Gonzalez, and I'm the State Director of the League of United Latin American Citizens for the State of Virginia, LULAC, and I'm very glad and honored to be here. Thank you, Andrew and Kate, for putting this together and for inviting me. And Andrew already mentioned my role as an advisor. I think my role was more of a pushing them to do something in this metropolitan area. Also, I heard Andrew's presentation about the research in Mexico, and then this year in May, he and Kate were invited to present at the Virginia Latino Advisory Board. And out of that, I think there was great interest in this should be taken to the at least now to the metropolitan area. I still get questions from some of my colleagues that where they're going to go farther than the metropolitan area in Virginia. But thank you, Andrew. So we're very pleased to be here. We have an extraordinary panel today. You're going to hear when we read about the immigrant community in the metropolitan area. We always hear in quotes from Michael Fix, Audrey Singer, Cecilia Munoz, and it is very important that today we have them in here talking to us. Our community, and they will be talking about that, has grown enormously. Like Andrew mentioned, this is a very diverse immigrant community in the metropolitan area that has grown by leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. It's really grown. I will encourage you to take the materials that are outside. They have the study conducted or the research by Michael Jones Correa from the Latino National Survey, as well as the other documents from the presenters. Audrey Singer's presentation is out there. And I think we're going to hear today from all of them and from this research that the Latinos, the immigrant Latinos in the metropolitan DC area are integrating, have the desire to be part of the society, want to participate, but they're learning. We're learning how to do it. We're learning why we have to do it, how it has to be done. We're a fairly new community, and several styles now. When I was preparing for this, I find out that they coincide and they say the same. They want to participate at the beginning. It's a little bit hard. It's a little bit difficult. They're learning, but as time goes by and they spend more time in the United States, their civic and political participation also increase. There is a very interesting study also put by the Center for the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute in Ayuda about common values, the American dream, and the U.S. political process. And that goes to reaffirm all the things that are going to be said in here, all the results that were done by the research done by Michael Correa, how people want to participate, how They hold strong values like family values, self-reliance, having a strong work ethic. They want to learn English language. That's constantly what we're hearing out there. They don't want to learn. They don't want to mix. They don't want to. That is not true. Immigrants want to learn English. There's not enough classes for all of them to participate. They want to become American citizens, and I think I've seen all that in all the strengths. They all want to become American citizens and want to participate and want to exercise the right to vote. They want to participate in the political process. And even though many came for work, also the research is showing that they're here to stay, that they're not going to leave. And maybe in the very few years that we're here in this country, we're always thinking of going back home. But as time goes by, also we realize that we're going to stay, and this is home, and we're going to be here, and we have families. They don't believe also that their legislative, the officials do not connect with their needs, and what better example that is happening in Virginia right now, particularly in Prince William. Some want to be politically engaged, but sometimes it's difficult for some of the immigrants to find out exactly what both political parties are not responding to them. And they share a strong belief in the American dream. We all want the American dream, that we can succeed if we work hard and we study and we get a good education. We have a good work ethic, and if we own our home, all the parts of the American dream that so many other immigrants have pursued before us. We have a strong alliance to the United States, and we also, again, believe that it's very important to participate in the political arena and that we have to be civically involved. So we're going to hear now the reaffirmation of all of those quotes that we hear, and I hope that we can keep communicating all this information to the media and to our elected officials and to everybody, and that we continue educating our community and helping them to succeed. We're going to have a good time for a panel. We have 90 minutes, and we're going to hear the presentations, and then we're going to have questions at the end. So we're going to have a very good time to have an interactions between the participants and the speakers. So I please hold your questions at the end, and if we can start with Audrey Singer. Oh, I'm sorry, I had to introduce you. See, I'm forgetting to introduce Audrey Singer. That's my role in here, to introduce. Audrey Singer is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Metropolitan Policy Program. Her areas of expertise include demography, international migration, immigration policy, and urban and metropolitan change. Audrey.
Thank you, Lenny. And I want to also thank Andrew and Flip and Kate and others at the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation to write this paper and to present it to you today. This couldn't be a more important issue in this region right now. Every day when you open the paper, there's another story about what's happening around the region regarding immigrants or their families or policies, local policies in the region. So I'm going to talk today briefly about Washington's Latin American immigrant population, where they're from and how that's changed over time, where they're living in the region, how that's changed over time, and some of their demographic and labor market characteristics. So this is just a broad overview to kind of set the stage for what's to come when we hear more about immigrants in the region and think about their civic and political participation in this area. First of all, immigration, as Andrew pointed out, is a relatively new thing to this region. Washington was not always an immigrant gateway. In 1970, in fact, the region was almost entirely native-born. But by 2006, 20% of the population was foreign-born. As the national capital, however, Washington's always had an international presence, a small one in the beginning, people working in embassies and international organizations, and a share of international students as well. But in the 80s and the 90s, the foreign-born population grew very quickly through a combination of factors, the expansion of international organizations. There was a fair amount of refugee resettlement in this region. And this base also attracted more immigrants who heard about opportunities and life in the region. And so through social networks, more immigrants came, particularly in the 1990s. The Latin American segment of the immigrant population has grown from a base of professionals and embassy personnel to a large and diverse population of immigrants from all the countries of Latin America. And Latin American immigrants now make up about 40% of the region's foreign-born. And whereas a couple of decades ago they were much more likely to be living in the district or in the inner suburbs, they're now moving to places in the outer suburbs. And as we've seen in some local jurisdictions, this is stirring up a volatile public debate. So that was my first line. Fast-growing, global, and now in the suburbs. The study that I'm going to present to you uses data from the Census Bureau. 1980 to 2006 is the time period that I'm looking at. When I say immigrant or foreign-born, I'm using these words interchangeably to include all persons born outside the United States, including naturalized citizens, legal permanent residents, temporary immigrants, refugees and asylees, and to the extent that they are covered in the U.S. Census, undocumented immigrants. And for the purposes of this paper, I'm using the term Latin American immigrants to include all persons born in any country in the Western Hemisphere except for the U.S. and Canada. So that's all countries in Central, South America, and the Caribbean, regardless of language spoken, race, ethnicity, or heritage, or ancestry. And that's partly a function of the way that Census Bureau produces the data, but most of that population is from Spanish-speaking Latin America. The Washington region includes 22 jurisdictions, so it's a pretty large metropolitan area. Just to give you a sense of where Washington falls in terms of total immigrants, it's now 7th of all metropolitan areas in terms of the size of the total immigrant population here. Over 1 million people are foreign-born in the region. These are the top 15 countries of birth in the region, and it's no surprise, and you all are interested in Latin America, that many countries are on that top 15 list. El Salvador is at the very top with over 133,000 counted in the 2006 American Community Survey done by the Census Bureau. There are 6 Latin American countries represented in the top 15. After El Salvador comes Mexico, then Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and Honduras. And you can see India, Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, and so forth are in between the Latin American cracks there. So as a whole, as I mentioned, Latin American immigrants now are about 40% of all foreign-born in the region. You can see immigrants from the countries of Asia are about 36%, Africa 14%, and I'll note that that's one of the highest proportions of any metropolitan area in the country. Europe 9%, other countries 2%. But the birth countries of immigrants living in the region have changed dramatically over the past 25 years, and this shows the source countries in 1980, and they're sort of color-coded. Green is Caribbean, blue South America, red Central America. You can see in 1980 the largest source country, or the largest country of birth among Latin American and Caribbean immigrants was Jamaica, followed by Cuba. In fact, there were over 25% of immigrants from the top 3 Caribbean countries, and about 36% or so were from South America. The largest was Colombia, and this was followed by Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador. So you can see pretty much a South American and Caribbean dominant flavor there. By 2006, Central America was clearly the most dominant region, with El Salvador immigrants from El Salvador making up over a third of all the immigrants in the region. Mexico, 10%, and Guatemala, 8%. So there were about, in total, 60% of the region's Latin American immigrants were from Central America in 2006, and 27% from South America, led by Bolivia and Peru. Those are, again, in blue. This is just to give you a sense of the total growth. About 60,000 Latin American immigrants lived in the region in 1980, and by 2006, that was almost 500,000, almost, over 400,000. This represents a 600% increase over that period of time. And just to put it into context, the region itself as a whole, the total population, was also a pretty fast-growing region. Over this 25-year period, it grew by 56%, and the total immigrant population grew by about 300%. Looking at when immigrants arrived in the United States, not necessarily to Washington, we can see that Washington's home to a large percentage of relative newcomers. So more than a third of Latin American immigrants living in the region in 2006 arrived after 2000. And 31% have arrived in the 1990s. I think that's a little cutoff, but that's a 31 down there. So since 1990, two-thirds of immigrants living here now arrived during that time period. This figure for 2000 or later is higher than the national average, which was about 25%. So you can see how not only this is a fast-growing region, but in terms of newcomers to this country, we have a higher proportion than a lot of areas. And this varies across local jurisdictions, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, actually, I'll talk about it right now. In places like Prince George's and the district, Fairfax and Montgomery, that proportion is a little bit lower, the proportion of newcomers since 2000, about 30%. In Arlington and Loudoun counties, however, it's about 44%. So there are a lot of people who are very new in those areas. In Prince William, however, and this is sort of an interesting, fun fact for people who are following the debate in Prince William, only 29% of the Latin American immigrants living in Prince William arrived since 2000. There are longer-term immigrants there. Essentially what we're seeing is people moving from within the region to further suburbs in the outer suburbs. This is just a quick map to show you settlement of Latin Americans in the region. You can see that the smaller map shows you that they are sprinkled around the counties outside of the core, but really you see that the inner core, the district, Arlington, Alexandria, and the three big inner suburbs and their jurisdictions really have a higher concentration of Latin American immigrants, and I won't go into the details here. Even though the Latin American population has its roots in the core, in the District of Columbia, particularly in neighborhoods like Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant, Columbia Heights, we can see that the population's grown very fast in other places. In 1990, in fact, if you look at all of the inner suburbs together, Montgomery and Prince George's, and Fairfax counties, they had more, first of all, in 1980, Montgomery County had more immigrants in absolute terms than the District of Columbia. The inner suburbs had more together in 1990, they had about 100,000, 250,000 by 2006. So that's where the core is. That's those long blue lines in the middle of the graph, if you can't see the text at the bottom. One important thing to note is there has been a decline in Arlington County since 2000. The Latin American population there has declined by about 13%. But as you recall in the previous slide about period of entry, 44% of the Latin Americans living in Arlington County arrived since 2000. So what we see is people leaving Arlington at the same time, newcomers coming to replace them, but not quite at the same rate as those that are leaving. By far the fastest growth is in the outer suburbs in Loudoun and Prince William. You can see Prince William on the end, kind of the leader in that regard, and it's no surprise that the most contentious debate in the region is taking place here. This is just a quick picture to show you how these differential growth rates across jurisdictions pan out in terms of the share of the total foreign-born population that is from Latin America, and you can see how that's changed over time. In some places, the share has shrunk. In only 2 jurisdictions are Latin Americans more than 50% of the total foreign-born population in those places, and that's Prince William and Prince George's County. And I have probably a minute and a half left, but you have this table and more things to explore in the paper, the printed copy. But let me just point out that Latin American immigrants in this region are more likely to be of working ages than the total population. In fact, they're almost entirely between the ages of 18 and 64 years of age. Their high school graduation rates tend to be similar if we just restrict educational attainment to high school as the native-born, but there are many, many more, a higher percentage, about 38%, who have less than a high school education. And you can see bachelor's and degree and higher is about 20%. About 2/3 of the region's Latin American immigrants are considered limited English proficient. That is, they don't speak English very well. Some very quick household characteristics, because I have 1 minute. Median income tends to be lower than the total population, about 55 versus 80, but the Latin American median income, household income is higher than the national average, which is about $8,000 less than that. About 9% are living below the poverty line, relative to about 6% of the total population, although if you double the percent poverty to 200%, you see about 28% of Latin American immigrants are living at 200% of the poverty level. Household size tends to be larger. I included mean persons per room, which is the standard way of looking at overcrowding in housing, and anything over 1 is considered overcrowded, and you can see here that Latin Americans in the region have not reached that, so I don't think there's any clear evidence of an overcrowding problem here. About 56% of Latin American householders own their own home. Labor force looks exactly like the total population in the region. The unemployed is the same, employed rate is the same, and it's very high. So I will, just one more thing, occupation. This is kind of an important point. If we're thinking about the mobility of immigrants and the prospects for their children, we can see here, in terms of broad occupational categories, Latin American immigrants are more likely to be working in service sector jobs, and in particular there we're talking about food preparation and building and grounds cleaning. And there are also much higher representation in construction jobs, about 24% relative to the total population. So I'll end here, but I just want to say we've got a lot of information here to think about how this population is integrating both socially and economically, and that has an effect on their civic and their civic involvement in their communities and in this country. And I think leadership is one of the most important things to help move Latin American immigrants into being more engaged in their communities. And by leadership, I mean both elected officials as well as community leaders. So I will end there, and I hope that helps our conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Now we are going to hear from Michael Fix. Michael Fix is the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Migration Policy Institute and the co-director of the MPI's National Center on Immigration Integration Policy. His work focuses on immigrant integration, citizenship policy, immigrant children and families, the education of immigrant students, the effect of welfare reform on immigrants, and the impact of immigrants on the U.S. labor force.
Well, thank you, Lenny, and welcome. I appreciate your coming, and I really want to thank Andrew, and I really want to thank Flip for the invitation to be here. What I'm going to just try to do this morning is to provide a little context for this day-long discussion that you're going to have by focusing. I can't believe I'm going to do this by focusing on the rather mundane issue of taxes paid by immigrants in the Washington Metropolitan Area. I'm not going to speak for long. I said, how can I ever speak for 8 minutes about taxes? But after all, the more I thought about it, I mean, first of all, it's a study that it's based on a study that we released about a year ago with the Urban Institute here in the Washington region. It's a study that I did with Jeff Bissell, who's now at the Pew Hispanic Center, and Randy Capps, who's at the Urban Institute. And the more I thought about it, the more we thought about it. It's not just a fiscal impact study when you think about taxes. Taxes paid in an odd way are really the ultimate metric of integration, of mobility within the society. This study that I'm going to talk about was commissioned by the Community Foundation and the Washington Area Partnership for Immigrants, and some of you were there when we released the study. When I went back to go over it, the first thing that struck me was that it was incredibly complicated and complex. So I thought, oh my God, I bet all I'm going to do this morning is do what I'm kind of capable of, which is that I'm going to summarize the results. I'm going to highlight the findings that are pertinent to the Latin American community here in the Washington region. And then at the end, I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about some of the implications of our results, not for immigration policy and not for immigration enforcement, which seems to be so of the moment here in the Washington region, but I'm going to do it to think about immigrant integration policy, which is the focus, as Lenny has said, of our new National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy at the Migration Policy Institute. And for your information, the study builds on a whole series of fiscal impact studies that we have done and tax studies that we had done of Los Angeles, of Illinois, and of New York, and even going back a few years, a study that we did of the unauthorized population in 7 major states. You know, it's crazy following Audrey to say anything about this region's demography, so I'm not going to say very much. But I'm just going to speak sort of personally on this. I am a third generation, what we refer to as cliff-dwelling Washingtonian. I have never thought for a minute of leaving. I work across the street from the building in which I initially lived. But to me, the change in the Washington metropolitan region is absolutely striking, and I could do a lot of hand-waving about numbers. But this map, in many ways, that was done by a colleague of Audrey's and mine, Marie Price, who's head of the geography department at George Washington University, kind of says it all for me. And what it says is that D.C. has now taken its place among only 20 metro areas in the world that have 1 million or more immigrants. And of course, D.C., like Dallas, are fairly new entrants into this million immigrant category. The region, as you start to think about taxes, and as Audrey has made vividly clear, is striking in its diversity. When we did the tax study, no single population accounted for more than 13% of the total population. This is in stark contrast to places like Los Angeles, in stark contrast to places like Houston. And in terms of the prosperity of the region, I was fooling around with what we call the Migration Data Hub, which we publish at the Migration Policy Institute and which is online. And I came across some remarkable facts, and that is that Virginia and Maryland had the lowest share of immigrants in poverty of any two states in the United States. They ranked 51st and 50th, according to the 2005 American Community Survey. And when we were doing the study, the other thing that is really quite important is that a great majority of the region's immigrants, about 80% of the region's immigrants, are themselves legally present. Let me just say a few words about the study. We looked across a wide range of federal, state, and local taxes. We included taxes paid by employers and taxes paid by immigrants themselves, and which we might refer to as passive taxes, the share of rent, for example, that can be ascribed to property taxes. We looked across all the major political jurisdictions in the Washington region. We disaggregated the results by sending country, by region, and by household legal status using this magical imputation strategy, which has been developed by Jeff Pissell. And in order to get the detail that you need to really report significant results within each of these political jurisdictions around this issue, we used the 2000 census. It's the old warhorse, and it is now a little bit old. So the results generally mean that we understate taxes paid in Virginia and in Maryland, and the district is a little bit of a different case. The deep, if you will, logic of the study was that there is a general perception that immigrants don't pay their fair share in taxes, and that Latino immigrants don't pay their fair share in taxes. And the Pew Hispanic Center did a survey in which they found that 56% of their respondents believe that immigrants don't pay their fair share in taxes, and I think our study kind of comes to rather different conclusions. So, the results of our study, when we went over it, were just great because the numbers were so round and easy to remember that even I could talk about them. According to our results, there were about 1 million immigrants in the Washington Metropolitan Area. They earned about $30 billion in income in 2000. They paid about $10 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. And very importantly, we found that the taxes that they paid are roughly proportional to their share of the population. That is to say that immigrant households make up about 21% of households in the region, and they account for about 18% of all taxes paid. Immigrants paid about a quarter of all taxes that came out of Montgomery and Fairfax County, these two enormous, hugely rich counties. And in fact, immigrant households in Northern Virginia and Maryland contributed 8% of all state taxes paid by households within Virginia and Maryland, so that the taxes that are paid by immigrants in Northern Virginia and southern and suburban Maryland don't just support local government services, they go to support services statewide across the state for which there are many, many beneficiaries. And as I'll discuss, the taxes that were paid varied widely by immigrants' place of origin, by their legal status, by their education, and by their English proficiency. All groups, however, it should be pointed out, paid substantial taxes. However, as the political leadership in this room knows very well, most of those big tax payments are not captured locally. 72% of taxes, income tax, Social Security tax, Medicare taxes, went to the federal government. only 17% of those tax payments went to the states in the form of income, sales, and auto taxes, and 11% was paid to local governments, mostly in the form of income, sales, and utility taxes. And of course, as Audrey has suggested, it is now at the state and particularly at the local level where services are provided and the very hard day-to-day work of promoting integration takes place. And, of course, where the political friction is hottest. Now, let me just digress for a minute and give you a little sense of the impact of some of this immigration on institutions within the Washington Metropolitan Area and follow up on what Audrey was saying and look a little bit at English language learners, the limited English proficient population in the schools. And this is the state. These are statewide data, and these are data over the last decade. And what you can see if you look at Maryland is you can see that the share of English language learners rose by about 60-65% over the decade 1995 to 2004, 2005, while the share of the overall K-12 population declined a few percentage points. If we look at Virginia, you see a very stark rise in terms of limited English proficient kid enrollment of about 200%, and a slight rise in total K-12 enrollment, which gives you some sense, I think, of the political and the distributional and some of the physical tensions that the political leadership faces as we go forward in some of these issues. And of course, one of the things to say is that funding for the program which supports English language acquisition from the federal government, which is Title III of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, declined in real terms between 2002 and 2006. At the same time, you have these kinds of population trends. So it's really quite striking. Our report makes clear that incomes and taxes rise with increased education, English language skills, and with the acquisition of legal status. And it suggests, I think, that investments in each of these, or in what we refer to as immigrant policy, may make a kind of economic sense. Now, I'm going to look and see if I can find a chart, which I didn't see. Excuse me. You know, is this the way it goes or what? Come on. Oh, dear. Okay, it's not there. Anyway, what do we do? What do we find when we disaggregate by county and by region? What we find is that the taxes that are paid by immigrants from El Salvador and from Mexico and other Americas were in fact substantially lower than those paid by many other sending groups, and are roughly half of those paid by native households in the region. The lower taxes were largely a function of legal status, of lower education, of relative English proficiency, as Audrey has suggested. And while I could dutifully walk you through all of them, I will simply say that if you look at English language acquisition, the level of taxes paid and incomes made is directly correlated to the level of English language proficiency, whether you speak English not at all, whether you speak English a little, whether you speak English well, very well, or whether you're a native English speaker. The rate goes exactly like this in terms of taxes paid, and that suggests that the way forward, well, it's most obviously to develop capacity to provide English language instruction to immigrant adults. It's to improve ELL instruction in schools, which is very tough. And if you want to see increased taxes, at least in the short run, what you want to do is provide permanent legal status to the unauthorized, whose incomes would rise, but whose tax compliance rates would rise as a result of the provision of legal status. Well, let me just close by noting that the mobility the integration challenges that are faced by immigrants in this region, like in the United States as a whole, isn't confined to immigrants who are coming with low educational credentials. We've been doing some analysis on this issue of credentialing and the recognition of foreign credentials. And what are some of our results are really quite striking. And here we have some results from for D.C., Virginia, and for Maryland. And what you'll see if you look at the middle bars is that almost 40% of highly educated Latin American immigrant workers who arrived in the United States after they were 25 and who had a BA or more, all right? These are people who got their degrees abroad, came to the United States, they have at least a BA or more. These are highly educated people. 40% are working in low-skill jobs. If you look at the population that's been here for 10 years or more, I mean, this is a settled population, the Latin American population who's been here for 10 years or more, 31% are working in low-skill jobs, a rate that is over double the rate for similarly situated natives. So that suggests that if you, as you put together an integration portfolio, you need to think about language, you need to think about legal status, but you also need to think, in this case, about the translation of foreign to native to U.S. credentials. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wish I could be more flexible with the time, and I am. I'm extending the 3 minutes, 5 minutes, but we have to go on. And we're now going to hear from Cecilia Munoz. She's the Senior Vice President, Office of Research, Advocacy and Legislation at the National Council of La Raza. She manages the NCLR legislative and advocacy activities, immigration policy, civil rights, employment, poverty, farm worker issues, education, and health.
Thank you very much. There's no PowerPoint, so no one else on the panel has to move. You're stuck with just me. And maybe the most important thing I can say is that you shouldn't mistake me for an expert on the D.C. area immigrant population. I work at the National Council of La Raza, and we're a national organization, and I have a national portfolio. I am lucky enough to be a member of this vibrant community, but my particular views in the community are no more well-informed than anybody else in this room who's a member of that community. What I can do is provide something of a national perspective and some insight maybe into how the local community connects to some of the national trends that are going on. I'm really sorry that Gustavo Torres hasn't made the panel, because it's so important that you hear from the people who are really driving this community forward, who are the real actors making things move. Although Lenny's here on the panel, and I know you're going to hear from Ana Sol Gutierrez and Pedro Avilés and others later. So though it's just important to understand that these are the people who are really driving this community forward, who are the real actors and agents of change. And my role here is much more as an observer and much more as a connector from the national level of the immigration issue and the broader Latino community. I've been asked to reflect a little bit on the extent to which, as a community, that there's some sort of sense of commonality of interest, right? As you've seen in D.C., but also nationally, the Latino community has extraordinary diversity, and there is something of a raging debate about whether we see ourselves as a community, as one whole community, or whether we see ourselves as Puerto Ricans or Mexican Americans or Salvadorans, or in my case, a Boliviana. And whether there is something larger that unites us and that motivates civic action. In some ways, the characteristics of the broader Latino community and the immigrant community within that community has tremendous variation regionally. So you have strong Puerto Rican presence in the Northeast along with the Dominican presence. Those are very different experiences. In the Midwest, you have places like Chicago, which is, I think, unique in having equal proportions of Mexican population as well as Puerto Rican population. Other parts of the Midwest which are experiencing extraordinary growth in the foreign-born population. and the Southwest, which has a very strong, quite old Mexican-American presence along with a significant and growing immigrant community. And then the Southeast, which has, uniquely in South Florida, a Cuban-American presence. And then in other parts of the Southeast, the fastest growing immigrant population in the country. In states like North Carolina and Georgia and other places, you have growth in the 300 and 400% range, which is pretty extraordinary. And each of those regional differences creates differences in the character of the community, in people's ability to engage in civic participation, in the infrastructure of organizations which are in place to help spur that participation, to help provide leadership, to help provide infrastructure. So in places like the Southwest, for example, you have very old community institutions, some of them, 40 years old or older. And in the Southeast, you have organizations that are younger than 10 years old, which are emerging as the community emerges in places where there was no significant Latino or foreign-born population 15 years ago, and which now has substantial growth in institutions which are just growing and just learning. D.C. is something of a hybrid, and you've seen some of the demographic reasons why. It has its own unique set of dynamics, its own sort of unique population, and it has tremendous diversity, and in that respect it has a lot. It's though the elements which make up that diversity are different here than they are in other parts of the country. At some level, the story of the immigrant population and the broader Latino population is one of diversity, and this sort of, it raises this question of do we see ourselves as separate parts, or do we see ourselves as part of one larger group with a common set of interests and a common capacity to mobilize and engage civically? There are, I think, multiple factors in what causes a foreign-born population to sort of do what I think of as turning the corner from focusing on their countries of origin to focusing on themselves and their communities as actors within the U.S. One of those, and we're certainly seeing this in the Cuban American community, is with the arrival of and the coming of age of the next generation, right? Of not the generation which is not foreign-born, but which is the children of foreign-born immigrants, and their perspective is naturally slightly different than the perspective of people who have left their homes and their families, who are sending remittances and who follow very closely the news of what's going on in their countries of origin, and engage very much, very often, in the politics around the countries of origin. Sometimes, and very often, those are politics which contributed to the migration in the first place. And you see something of a turning the corner when that generation's children begin to come of age. And a second kind of turning the corner factor is when a community has been around long enough to begin to develop the infrastructure to engage, to begin to focus internally, to begin to see itself as a U.S. population, to begin to understand its stake in the institutions of its own community, and to begin to advocate for change. I think a great example of that has been the changes in the D.C. immigrant serving organizations. There we have newer organizations as well as organizations which have been around for a good long time. But to trace the development of an organization like CASA of Maryland, for example, I first came into contact with CASA maybe 15 years ago or so, when it was still a refugee-focused organization. I became a member of its board of directors. I was for a while the only Latina in the room of a great board of directors of essentially church people who had helped develop this organization as kind of part of the sanctuary movement as refugees were coming to this area from Central America. And what happened is that CASA turned a corner and began to develop immigrant leadership, and is now, in fact, an immigrant-led organization, and it's not only one of the leaders in the D.C. metropolitan area, but it's fast becoming a leader nationally for the quality of its work, the quality of its leadership, and the real innovation of its work in day labor networks and in dealing with the specific population in D.C., particularly people who are brought here as domestics from employed by foreign-born diplomats and other kinds of professionals that come uniquely to D.C. So CASA is one of many institutions which has kind of turned that corner from being led by natives of the United States in service of immigrants and refugees to an immigrant-led organization which is both providing services and doing community organizing. And there are many other examples of organizations like that. Carecen is another. Strong Central American leadership, a strong presence both in terms of representing and dealing with the needs of refugees, but which is also becoming a leader in expressing the community's views and participation in the issues of the D.C. metropolitan area and questions like housing and social policy. And that is, a clear sign of adding a focus in addition to a focus on events in Central America and on the factors which tend to drive migrants to the United States. The third element which really contributes to this turning the corner is the thing that we are awash in right now, and that is the phenomenon that I like to think of as, whether or not you happen to be Bolivian or Central American, whatever. To folks on the outside, we're all kind of just a bunch of Mexicans, and Mexicans who are viewed in fairly harsh terms. We're in an unusually hostile climate right now, particularly aimed at immigrants, particularly aimed at Latino immigrants. The poster child for that happens to be the group of Latino immigrants which are most numerous nationally, and that happens to be the Mexican population. So that's kind of what converts us all in the eyes of folks outside of the community into one phenomenon. And that makes it easier for people to view themselves as part of one phenomenon. So while in my particular family's customs and tradition, I have a strong identity as a Bolivian American. The fact of the matter is, in terms of the challenges that we're facing as communities, we're all kind of the same. We are more likely to see each other as the same. And this particular moment in history that we're in was one of a cycle of events which is really characterized Latino immigrant participation and also Latino civic participation. The last big such moment was about 10 years ago in the mid-1990s, when there were national debates on immigration reform. There were ugly debates in key states, including California, which were also marked by great hostility towards immigrants, great attacks on the contributions that immigrants were providing, challenges to their access to benefits. All of those things sound very familiar. We are repeating that environment again today in a way which has a real galvanizing effect on this community. And obviously the most visible sign of that galvanizing effect were the marches that took place, not just here but around the country. And in some ways, those marches were both an expression of a sense of frustration, a sense of belonging, and a sense of unwillingness to continue to be invisible, and frankly, courage on the part of immigrants themselves who were potentially exposing themselves by coming forward. And then it also an expression of the desire to become American. The point of the marches was about access to legal status, access to a pathway to citizenship. But it was also about, and this was much less covered, linkages between the foreign-born population and the native-born population. So while immigrants, and undocumented immigrants in particular, were front and center in the marches and front and center in the coverage of the marches, they were not the only people who marched. And NCLR did a poll in November of '96 to try to get a sense of whether or not there was a connection between the civic participation that we saw, the turning out into the streets that we saw, and the Latino electorate, right? Because a lot of people were saying, well, those folks were just immigrants and they are by definition not politically engaged because they don't have the franchise. And that doesn't necessarily translate into electoral participation. And what we found was that about a third of the Latino voting adults that we surveyed had participated in the marches or knew someone close to them who had participated. And perhaps more importantly, among the young Latino voters that we surveyed, it was almost half who had participated in the marches themselves or knew someone very close to them who had marched. And that suggests a pretty strong correlation between this kind of moment of civic activism focused on immigrants, but which included and was very much contained also the U.S. Latino population, particularly and importantly the population with access to the vote. And that is both an indicator of integration, it's an indicator of commonality of purpose, and it remains to be seen whether it will be an indicator in sort of strength and visibility and ability to make change electorally. one of the most interesting and perhaps most important side effects of those marches was the creation of something called the We Are America Alliance, which is a historic alliance of immigrant organizations that serve immigrants or are often led by immigrants around the country, focusing on immigrant civic participation, particularly access to naturalization, voter registration, and voter mobilization. So a lot of, from the Latino community, many of our sort of more mainstream organizations such as NALEO and NCLR are part of that alliance. These are organizations with deep background in helping immigrants naturalize and register to vote and turn out to vote. But also importantly, there are organizations like the SEIU, the fastest growing labor union in the country, among the largest, with a significant, really enormous immigrant participation. There are groups that do work also with other immigrant communities, part of that alliance, and also very importantly, there are important local actors, including CASA of Maryland and the NCIC, the National Capital Immigration Coalition, and Pedro's here, so I know you're going to be hearing more about that later. But what is significant about this for the D.C. region and for the purpose of today's meeting is that what you're beginning to see is the D.C. area emerging among the national leadership of immigrant-led organizations, immigrant advocacy and immigrant-serving organizations, participating in national structures and helping lead national structures that are really leading the charge for the community across the country. So while 20 years ago, when the major immigrants' rights coalitions were forming in the states with acknowledged huge populations in New York, in Illinois, in Los Angeles, there was no similarly situated coalition forming in the D.C. area. We now have a coalition which is developing and is really joining its place among the leadership of the immigrants' rights coalitions in those major cities. And D.C. is, as Michael pointed out, kind of taking its place among the large cities with large immigrant populations and infrastructure, which is both serving those populations and acting as advocates for those populations and empowering those populations really to speak for themselves. And the great challenge before the D.C. community, as well as the rest of us around the country, is whether or not we can turn this incredible moment of focus and energy and commitment, which is really extraordinary and is really a national phenomenon, into participation in the polls and into a broader sense of civic participation. So, the way I like to express it and sort of my dream for what this movement becomes with our relationships with labor unions and faith-based organizations and the emergence and growing strength of immigrant-led immigrants' rights coalitions, is this notion that we work together to empower the community, to help the community raise its voice, that we accomplish the immigration reforms that we've all been talking about and working towards, but that even as we accomplish those goals, and I continue to believe that we will accomplish those goals, that we will have developed the relationships and the power and the infrastructure to do the other things which are necessary, which also relate to some of the data that you saw, to advance our position economically, to go after things like health care, health coverage, and wages. So that's really the challenge, is whether or not this moment of energy can turn into a broader moment of energy, not just focused on immigration policy, but the broader set of needs that this community faces. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Cecilia. Gustavo Torres was confirmed to be here, but we are sorry. We're gonna miss him. He has not arrived, so we're gonna go now to a period of questions and answers. We are gonna take 3 questions. We're gonna let them respond, and then we'll take the next 3 questions. We have approximately 25 minutes, and we need to be on time. I please urge you to be concise and precise in your questions, and make sure that you mention the name of the person you are directing the question, or if it's to the panel. So let's open it for questions. Emma?
Chair of the board of the Northern Virginia Community College, as well as the president of Escuela Bolivia, a nonprofit 501c3. my question goes to Odd, Ms. Signer, and also Mr. Fix. Because as I look at the strategic plan, for example, of Northern Virginia Community College, serving, Northern Virginia, where we have a significant number of immigrants, it seems that the decision makers or the people that are in Richmond truly do not understand the relationship that you mentioned between investing in education and especially all those immigrants that also have degrees in their country of origin. And, for example, the universities in Virginia deny admission to undocumented who have not graduated from the public schools. In some cases, our undocumented students who graduated from public schools can attend, for example, Northern Virginia. They pay out-of-state tuition. But that's not the case for immigrants who are professionals. What recommendations do you have for us who work day in and day out with education issues?
Any other questions? We want to take 3 questions at a time. And I'm sure you all have questions. Ana Sol?
I'm a state delegate in Maryland, and I'll be on the next panel, but I think we're not going to get too many chances to ask questions, so I want to take advantage of this. Just a brief comment. I have a frustration in hearing the 3 speakers provide a very well-researched, incredible amount of information when we know that we need that information for making public policy. And I constantly have the frustration that we are not able to keep up with what's happening on the ground, and that public policy is kind of being reactive to a lot faster changes than what we're able to do by observing it through research and through long-term data. I would love to hear what your suggestions would be of how we can perhaps have your data be accessible in a shorter time frame for the public policy to be influenced. That's kind of my general question.
My name is Carlos Labiosa. I'm the bad person in Prince William County that did a study on immigration. I am the chair of the Immigration Committee for the Human Rights Commission. Everything I heard from all the panel members was very important, very good information. The frustration I have and the question I have is, how could we open ears of the politicians, specifically in Prince William County, when they don't even want to listen to that information in relation to taxes? We have heard that information in relation to education, but in Prince William County, we present these studies to the politicians, and a suggestion is, how can we get them to go to a doctor to clean out their ears so they listen to this information? We presented a study. We did a executive study from the Human Rights Commission to the County Board of Supervisors before they did their vote. The best thing, and without saying bad words, the best thing they said about the study was it was hogwash. And they said this Puerto Rican, because I'm Puerto Rican, didn't even know what he was talking about. How can we get these politicians to listen? Because we have all this data, all this information, but specifically in Prince William County, it doesn't do any good at all.
Thank you. If we can. I will let you decide who's going to be the first one to answer the first question. These are very good questions, but we can start. The first question.
Okay, the first question was how can we get people to pay more attention to the fact that there are high returns on investment in terms of education for immigrant and for Latino populations, and make them quite serious about that. Well, there's couple of things. First of all, I think we need to have a much better sense of how kids are doing in schools. particularly how English language learners are doing in schools. I think we need to know whether they are graduating. I think the statistics on graduation rates are very opaque, to say the least, and I think that in the wake of No Child Left Behind and the fact of No Child Left Behind's standards, there are school systems have incentives to take English language learners, particularly in middle and high school, and to move them out of school systems, and we have to see if that's happening. And see if it is happening, we have to make sure that the incentives are reversed and keep them in schools and keep them graduating and on track and then into the post-secondary education systems. I think there's a lot more leakage. The grads suggested there's a lot more leakage than people have thought that's going on. In terms of community colleges, one of the things, and we can connect community colleges and credentials in some ways, because in many cases, students have to go, students may come from for nursing from a background from another country, and they may need a single course to really qualify to be for the occupational status that they're seeking. But in fact, as they come into the U.S. system, they have to take a whole package of courses, which takes a long period of time and it takes a lot of money. And we need to think a lot about this post-secondary credentialing occupational system so that people can get just exactly what they need in order to enter the occupation that they're seeking, and that we haven't erected a set of artificial barriers to entry. So that's, I could go on obviously, but I will cease and desist.
Did you want to address the first question?
Yeah, I'll say, just to kind of pick up on some of the themes here, in terms of education, it's human nature to look at the short term, and that goes to your point as well. But really, we need to start thinking about things long term. I mean, think about the trouble we're in with Social Security and all these other massive issues. The same could be true if we think about how we're educating this generation that is up and coming right now, including immigrants and the children of immigrants. And when you look at the demography of this nation, when you look at this rising baby boom cohort that turned 60 last year, that's about to obliterate us with all these old people walking around in about 20 years. You stopped it. I'm part of that. I'm part of that generation. You think, who's going to be there for us? How well equipped are they going to be? Do they have the skills to compete not only in, or to provide the kind of labor force not only that we need in our communities and in this country, but as an economy that is a part of a globalized economy. And so, the arguments are clear when you look at the numbers. It's just making them stick. Having people have a little bit of foresight is the tricky part.
So in some ways, I don't want to preclude addressing Ana Sol's question, which I think is really important, which is how to get timely data in the hands of people who need it. But in some ways, your question is connected to the question that you asked, which is, what's the magic formula for unstopping the ears of politicians who are really acting in defiance of the facts? And boy, if I knew what that formula was, I feel like we would all be in a different place. This is, the immigration debate is this sort of crazy fact-free zone right now. But it is, right, this is a debate which is being driven by emotion, and it's being driven by the fact of demographic change and, frankly, the fear of demographic change, right? So there's a reason this is happening in Prince William County, and in some ways Audrey's data really painted the picture really well. If you sort of follow the demographic trends, you can almost predict exactly where the next local ordinance is going to be proposed, right? Because it's the places where we're showing up. And there is a pretty clear political calculation being made here, and that is, right, that there are voters who are upset about their neighborhoods looking different and who are upset about and maybe don't understand the facts about the economic contributions of immigrants and have all kinds of myths that are really ridiculously difficult to dispel about the impact of immigrants on crime, which is actually that, the crime goes this way, but they think it goes this way, the impact on, the economic impact, all of those things. But there are groups of voters who are deeply concerned about that and have a lot of intensity, and there are groups of immigrants who, many of whom are not voters, and there's something of just a straight-up political calculation being made here that's going to require us to do multiple things. So the study that you did was tremendously important, even though they didn't listen, because it helps to highlight the fact it's beginning to show around the country, and the rest of the country is following Prince William County. I hear about it all the time from around the country. And people are noticing that these are politicians acting in defiance of the facts. And the reason they can notice that is because you put the facts in front of them and they ignored them. And that is tremendously important because it's part of a trend. It's what allows us to illustrate that this actually isn't about the facts. It's about something else. And that something else is us, right? And our presence and the fact that we're the largest minority in the country now. We are present all over the country now. And a big chunk of the country is uncomfortable with that. And that's part of the conversation that we need to lead. So we need the facts. We need to be able to somehow engage in a constructive conversation that identifies the fact that some of this is about fear. And then the third thing we need to do is about power. At some level, this is happening to a certain extent because there are folks who fear that we have power as a community, as immigrants, and as a broader ethnic community. And if we start behaving as if we did, one imagines we could get to a different place. But ultimately, we need to be combining all of those things.
I'm going to take a minute to respond to Carlos. As a community activist, as somebody who's in the trenches and constantly in contact with the people, con el pueblo, con la gente, how we're going to get them to listen? We have to vote. Next Tuesday, for 5 days from today, 6 days from today, is election day in Virginia. Probably one of the most important elections because the entire legislative assembly is up for re-election. Senators and representatives, the state representatives. We have to vote, and also the local elections that are very important. There's several local elections. Probably the most known is the one in Prince William County, just because what is happening is. But there are local elections in many other jurisdictions. Arlington has a local election. All the ones have also local elections. But we as a community have to go and vote. And we're new, we're learning. We have to continue working together. That is very important. We have to continue working together and educating the people. There's so much misinformation flying around right now. And I don't see, as a community activist and also, I will take part of that blame, that we're not working together and putting the correct and right information for the people to calm down their fears, because a lot of these things are only on paper. Nothing has been said yet. It's just paper, it's just ideas, it's rhetoric and it's ideology. And some people are saying, I'm not like, yes, we are not liking him, but I don't have to leave. I don't have to leave yet, but I don't have to. So we have to work together and educate the people and send the correct information. And the ones we can, and the ones we are able to do it, we have to push to make it to the polls on Tuesday and make sure that every able voter, Latino and non-Latino, that is on our side, goes and vote in this election that is so important. I'm going to take the next, we have time for three more questions. Oh, yeah, Audrey, yeah.
I wanted to jump into the data and studies, because that's sort of my comfort zone. I guess I want to say a couple things. One is data and the frequency with which it's come out has gotten better recently. The Census Bureau has something new called the American Community Survey. It's done every year. It's like having the census every year. Until last year, we had to wait every 10 years to get data on immigrants in this country. And the American Community Survey is designed to provide not only the national picture, but local areas with their community. Okay, it's not perfect. If people will dispute it, that could be the next thing. You know, people say, well, I won't go there. But what's important is that we use this data when it comes out. And I'll point out that the 2006 data that I used in my presentation today arrived sometime I think, at the end of August or so. So it's a pretty quick turnaround time to kind of move it through. Now, that's the good news, I think, that we have more data on a more regular basis. The harder question is, how do you get people to listen, and how do you get people to embrace the fact that we do have information that's valuable, that can guide us, and that can be used, of course, in all different ways, but to frame the discussion. And I think people have to really start using it as much as possible, from reliable sources.
Well, since this is my comfort zone too, I would just say part of the issue here is we don't have some of the answers that we need. You know, I think that when I fool around with these tax numbers, for example, they are really a third of the knowledge equation. A second third of it is the cost equation, which is what the people who are opposed to immigration always talk about. But then the third piece, which we really have a fairly fuzzy, good quantitative understanding of, is the total contribution of immigrants to the economy as a whole. I mean, the physical piece, which is taxes and benefits, is about 10% of the total U.S. economy. There's another 90% of this piece, of which the knowledge is not very solid. We had a very good study that was done in North Carolina by the University of North Carolina, which tried to put all the pieces together. We had a good study that was done in Arkansas that tried to put all the pieces together. 10 years ago, we had the National Academy of Science put all the pieces together in a good national study. We sorely need the successor to that National Academy of Science piece. And that's not going to make people listen, but that's an investment in making people listen down the road. You know, that study, I think, sidelined some noxious stuff 10 years ago. I'm not sure it would today, but maybe in 3 or 4 years.
We have time for one more set of questions. Yes, Mercedes.
Mercedes Lamb, I'm the director for the Mayor's Office on Latino Affairs. In Washington, D.C., we have, it's probably not a unique problem, but we do have a large population of African-American community, and we have the issue of day laborers as well. And one thing that's happening is that there's a tension because of the perception of the immigrant community taking jobs from the Latin American community, or from the African American community. And I was just wondering if you had any models, or if you know of any models where something has been done to bridge the tension between the African American community and the Latino community or other immigrant communities.
The gentleman, and then you yourself. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't saw your hand. The gentleman had it up there, back in the first. Can you pass the microphone to him?
Hi, my name is Jeremiah Ucabiella. I'm a program officer with Liberty's Promise, and last week I saw a Princeton University professor who gave a talk about the militarization of the U.S. border and how it's basically backfired by increasing the death and injury rate for people crossing the border, decreasing the apprehension of illegals crossing the border, increasing the tax burden to the U.S. citizens, and creating exploitation of immigrants as a result of the subcontracting companies that came about. So I guess my question is, I don't know if you're familiar with that data, but and also his main point was that it decreased the out-migration by creating a situation where it's more difficult for immigrants who initially plan to return home to return. So my question would be, how would you view the militarization of the border since the mid-90s, and especially specifically to the D.C. area?
And there's two hands in here, this gentleman with glasses and the lady with the green blouse. If you promise me that you're going to be brief and concise in your questions, I'll let you go. That will be the last. So this gentleman and then the lady in the green blouse, please. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Wes, and I'm a student at Johns Hopkins. and basically just we're studying Mexico. I just have a question about taxes and also just employment figures that seem very high. Income's very high in D.C., but in the West, I've seen articles where people come here and then they can't get work. I was just wondering why. Basically, just can you flesh that out? Why is it so? Why is there so much success in terms of immigrants being able to sort of find a place to work and fit in with this particular area?
And thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniela Martinez, and I'm a junior fellow at the American Friends Service Committee. And I wanted to address my question to the issue of education, and I'm sorry if you guys had more innovative questions because we've already brushed this issue. But my organization has been following the DREAM Act very closely during the past, well, for a long time, but particularly these past 2 months. And one of the, I guess, sentiments vary towards that bill within my organization, in part due to the military provisions. And we've had politicians and, congressmen say, for whatever reasons that they said, that the Latino population is particularly ideal for recruitment. And we fill in the blanks and assume that they mean, well, because some of us are undocumented, because some of us don't have money to pay for college, which is also an option in the DREAM Act. So I guess my question is, what are your sentiments towards that? I mean, what do you think? Do you think that we are a vulnerable population because we can't get an education? Do you think that has to do with money, or do you think that there's another factor involved in that? Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, let's go in that order. Mike, Cecilia, and Audrey. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let me go backwards and just say a word about the DREAM Act. I think that the DREAM Act is a useful political compromise, and it's better than the counterfactual, which is the world we're living with now. But the DREAM Act is itself a very odd piece of legislation. I can't think of any other piece of legislation which is so prescriptive in terms of the federal government's intercession into an individual's life. In other words, it prescribes two paths for them, two potential paths for them. They can either join the military or go to post-secondary education. I just have never seen, it's just thinking of it in policy terms, it's very unusual in that way. And of course, this is a very vulnerable population because the dropout rates among, in particular, Hispanic youth, and in particular undocumented Hispanic youth have been extraordinarily high over time. Where the DREAM Act would create a new set of incentives and might reverse those, but nonetheless, when we estimated the impact of the DREAM Act, we had to take into account these dropout rates, and they were really quite strong. In terms of the growth in terms of why immigrants meet success here, it's because, as Audrey said, it's been an incredibly growing region in terms of its economic prosperity. I mean, as a whole, the region is just stunning, and of course, it's it's in large part the growth of the federal government under the Bush administration.
I'll try to do my best with as many of the questions in a short time. On the DREAM Act, I mean, I think Michael's right that it's a political compromise. I think if the only option it provided in order to gain access to legal status for students was a military option, I think you would not have seen the strong support for it that you have seen across the community. I think the fact of the matter is that both immigrants in the Latino community and Latinos who are not immigrants have high rates of military participation and have historically for a long time. And it's, there are probably a combination of factors which contribute to that, and economic need is probably one of them. I don't think it's the only one. There is a certain amount of patriotism and sort of proving yourself as Americans that is connected to that as well. And in some communities, if you go to San Antonio, Texas, for example, it is part of a long, proud tradition in that community. So however one feels about it, I think it's just a fact that this is a community which participates in the military at fairly high rates. But ultimately, the paths that the DREAM Act were trying to create were really aimed at education. And frankly, in order to get some of the political support that we needed, the military piece was added. I wanted to also address your question on models of collaboration between African Americans and immigrants. This is a source of real tension. It is also, I continue to believe, a source of real opportunity, especially now because it's so clear how badly this issue is being demagogued, that my African American colleagues who, God bless them, did radio tours on African American radio during the debate on the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, came back and reported that, you know, they would start these conversations and it would be a fairly uncomfortable place, but when they kind of talked about, you know, where a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment was coming from and how it was being expressed, that it wasn't very hard to begin to demonstrate commonality of interest and to begin to hear commonality of interest among the people who were calling into those shows. The organizations that I have seen model really successful collaboration efforts are organizations like ACORN and the Center for Community Change, who are doing community organizing locally, not around immigration issues. They're not asking people to, like, let's sit down and hammer out how we're all going to believe in immigrants. They're sitting people down and talking about poverty and developing anti-poverty strategies and strategies to work on wages and healthcare and some of the other issues where we clearly have commonality of interest. And the tensions over the immigration piece are getting worked out at that table. So that I've spoken with, you know, incredibly effective groups of advocates, you know, African American advocates from low-income communities who come to Washington to lobby on the immigration bill because they see it as part of an anti-poverty strategy where we all need to be on a level playing field. That's very powerful stuff. And on the militarization of the border, I absolutely agree that it's been destructive and counterproductive, like many of the immigration policies that we pass. It is also like the easiest thing for Congress to throw money at. There is. I mean, in an environment where there's lots of ratcheting down of the federal budget, this is an area which you can bet on it going up. And it does every year. We're in an environment right now where politically, any immigration enforcement is good. To the, you know, people who are political actors, to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And it is ferociously difficult to raise any kind of conversation about establishing priorities, using resources wisely, you know, looking at costs and benefits and effectiveness. That's just an incredibly difficult conversation to have, because right now the only conversation is more is good, and we have a long way to go before we get somewhere else.
Okay, real quickly, I'll leave aside the DREAM Act because I think that was covered very well. In terms of the economy of this region, getting back to that just real quickly, Washington's strong economy is based not only on the federal government, which has this huge stability, but there's been a growth in the high-tech sector and a bunch of other things that bring in immigrants to this region. Since the population is still growing and expanding outward, we've seen, you know, a proliferation of building happening, particularly at the fringes, but also infill inside. So, you know, people need houses built, services, including, you know, everything related to homes. So, and you saw that those were the two largest occupational sectors that Latin American immigrants were in. So there's, you know, this is an economy that's being buoyed by immigrant labor. At the same time, immigrants are finding opportunities here. You know, that doesn't mean that there aren't problems with poverty and underemployment and those kinds of issues. To Mercedes's question on relationships between African Americans and immigrants, I agree with Cecilia. This is one of the toughest issues out there, and it's partly because of a competition factor. You know, in the 60s and 70s during the Civil Rights Movement, immigrants were embraced by the African American community. There were very few immigrants here. They were part of the affirmative action movement. As the immigrant population has grown, we've seen a lot more tension, particularly among lower skilled immigrants in certain sectors and African Americans. And so, again, a lot of this has to come down to education and information getting out, getting back to that issue, and drawing a different line, as Cecilia suggests, around this group and their commonalities, particularly in terms of employment issues and mobility. The third and last thing I'll talk about is the militarization of the border. I'm assuming you're talking about Doug Massey's work, which I know very well. In fact, I worked on this project in the early 90s. And so I can tell you that here it is, 2007, and you're receiving this information, something that we started working on a very long time ago. So back to Anna's point, it takes a very long time for information to get out. We knew about that even before the buildup at the border, that this was happening. But as the money's been kind of thrown at enforcement issues and border security, we've seen this change where immigrants are now coming to this country and staying here rather than circulating back and forth across the border, which is a huge irony. So I think it really points to this issue of how to understand the processes around us in real time and how difficult it is. And I will end there.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I thank you, the panelists, for the extraordinary job that you did and giving us the most useful information. Thank you to the Wilson Center, the Mexico program in Mexico, Andrew and Kate, for having this panel together. And Andrew, the next panel starts at 11 o'clock. So you have a few minutes to for a coffee break, and we'll resume at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. This was so great. Great.